I'm super excited to have Sebastian Lustig come and talk. So Sebastian's professor at Osnabrück in Germany. It's also got an affiliation with Brown. Most of you, or hopefully many of you, will remember he gave a really interesting talk on AutoRA, the system he's been building. So he gave us a talk a year ago. It's progressed enormously since then, and so he's very kindly agreed to stay up late in Germany and give us this update on what's going on. So Sebastian, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to present to the group meeting again. And a lot of the work that you've been producing has been an inspiration for us all along, and so we've been following along your work, and so I'm really happy to share some of ours. Before I get started, how long should I aim for the talk? Like how many minutes approximately? Is it
we have the room for an hour. I mean, you could aim for like 40 minutes and then have 20 minutes of discussion, though knowing this group, you'll probably get interrupted multiple times, so you can just play it by ear. Yeah.
That's perfect. I don't have an agenda, so
Okay.
Switch topics whenever. Okay, what I would like to do in this talk is to discuss the problem of automated scientific discovery from the in application to cognitive science, and I would particularly like to address the question of why we should apply AI for science in this field. I think it's a question that is more often neglected than it is asked, because you see all this hype going around. I'll talk to you about it, about applying AI for science without necessarily asking why do we need it and where can it be most effective. So this is going to be some of the focus of the talk that I'm going to give today. All right, so now let me find my slides right here. All right, so my background is actually in the domain of cognitive control. This is this human capability of essentially being capable of guiding information processing in the brain in service of a task. And this includes talking about many different faculties of human cognition, including the ability to switch tasks, to multitasks, and perform single tasks in the face of distraction, maintain many things in working memory, and many others. And I've been particularly interested in why humans are limited in those faculties, especially given the brain has billions of neurons to process in parallel, but we can only barely do one or two tasks at the same time. So when I entered my PhD, I was intrigued by this question, and I thought naively, well, there has been all of these different domains and faculties in cognitive control, and I thought, over time, it's been about a century of studying those kind of limitations. And I thought that, over time, people might have come up with a theory of task switching. And as time progressed over the decades, then people may have, came up with a more grander theory of multitasking. And so that incorporates more and more and more of these faculties. Now, unfortunately, that wasn't the case, to my frustration, trying to deal with this topic and problem. In fact, what actually happened was the following. The first task switching experiment was actually conducted to study consciousness. In fact, Alan Alpert designed this task switching experiment in a way of measuring this conscious process of switching between tasks. And what they found in this experiment is that task switching takes longer than task repetition, right? So repeating a task is just quicker than switching to another. And they found this effect quite intriguing, and then they started studying it, and they found that it is influenced by many different factors, like the timing between the stimulus and the response, and the cue and the response, and so on. And they tried to build a little theory around it, and they found other things too. They found that it is influenced by potentially episodic memory processes, meaning that while you're doing this task, you might be retrieving information from your episodic memory that may interfere with your current task, and that can also lead to switch costs. And they built a second theory around it, or at least tried to. And then someone else came around and said, hey, we are typically instructing folks to switch tasks. What about voluntary task switching? And then they started building things around that. And so rather than integrating those theories, what actually happened was kind of a fragmentation in our field. And so people found more and more specific effects and built smaller and smaller and smaller models and theories around them without ever actually integrating, getting this integrative understanding of how it all fits together. And the way you can think about it to visualize it is kind of like sort of like the sea of islands, where every island represents a particular I would say, experimental paradigm to study human cognition and cognitive control, like task switching, dual tasking, task interference, and so on. And researchers are sitting on those islands and they're studying the local fauna and species, right? The very local effects. But their view is somewhat myopic in the sense that they fail to see, they fail to understand and see what's going on the other islands. And that prevents us from gaining a very integrative understanding of human cognition in this domain, which is really frustrating. In fact, even if you're attempting to build integrative models of cognition, which is what I was originally doing, it is very hard to do so because the paradigms are so different. You can't even match them. And this is a particular problem in cognitive science, psychology, neuroscience, that we have this fragmentation of experiments and models, and we have to deal with it somehow. On top of that comes the unfortunate insight, or at least, well, realization, I would call it. It's not necessarily an insight, it's more of a realization I had, that the limitations of the system that I was interested in studying, multitasking limitations, for instance, are the very limitations of the system that we're starting it with, right? That means we as scientists are inherently limited in the number of experiments we can consider at the same time, the number of models we can consider at the same time, and of course, the number of scientific findings we can produce. And that also contributes to this empirical fragmentation, our inability to integrate across many different experiments and kind of computational understandings of mind and behavior. So of course, the goal was then to say, right, how can we leverage AI scientists to advance this understanding of mind and brain, with the idea being that we would suddenly be able, previously we've been able to kind of iterate in a very small space of experiments and models that we as humans could pass and think of. But the integration of AI in this process would help us not only to vastly expand the space of models and experiments, but if we could formulate it in a closed loop, we could immensely accelerate the search and hopefully gain a quicker understanding of what kind of appropriate models are out there to explain human behavior. And the way this looks like basically very abstractly in the behavioral sciences, you can think of the psychologist or neuroscientist as a human scientist providing instruction to the artificial scientist sitting on a server and then iterating through this loop of experimentation and modeling, where the experiment is really being performed on human participants. So we can conduct web-based online studies to study behavior. And the system can then collect data from those participants, build scientific models, make predictions, and then figure out what's the next best experiment we can run. And while we're at it, we could also, of course, document every step in the process. You all know this. I don't have to tell you the advantages of this. But what's particularly interesting here is that we can't just document the methods and results. We can also document the thought processes, right? Because we have a more granular, access to the scientific process, since it is all formalized. And of course, once the artificial scientist runs out of money to spend on experiments, it can then return its insights in the form of discovered models or experiments back to the human scientist, who could have allocated her cognitive resources to more, creative problems. And that is the system that we've been building called AutoRA. And I don't have to walk you through all of the different exciting directions that are currently happening in and around the topic AI for science. I recently saw that the White House actually announced an initiative on AI for science, investing a lot of money into that space. I just want to note that it's actually it all dates back to the topic of automated scientific discovery quite a while ago. And this is a somewhat small group that has been thinking about this not only for the last 5 years, since the hype of large language models, but also much, much earlier, dating all the way back to Herb Simon, who already realized that scientific discovery can be formalized as basically a type of problem solving, right? He was really concerned with discovering basically computational formulations of how humans solve problems in the form of heuristics, for instance, and then realized, well, this could be transferred to scientific discovery, and in that sense also be used to automate certain aspects. And since then, we have been, even before this whole hype in terms of using large language models, I want to note there's been various applications, right, in AI for science or automated scientific discovery of closed loop systems that actually led to real discoveries, like the robot scientist discovering, for instance, or one of his successors discovering that triclosan, a compound found in toothpaste, is effective against malaria, right? So this system was capable of completely autonomously conducting experiments on orphan genes in the yeast metabolism. And we have this in all kinds of domains, and I'm going to briefly skip over this because I know you've been all familiar with. Of course, we have it in computer science where experimentation is quite easy to do because we can do it in silico. And there's the trend of multi-agent discovery that we're currently seeing. At least in this year, a couple of papers came out that are leveraging multi-agent systems for discovery, let's say in biology or material science. But what I would like to do here is really outline when do we really benefit from such approaches in the domain of cognitive science. And I think it's always important to ask this question before we blindly apply AI methods and automate scientists. And here I want to talk about the concrete problems that we have in cognitive science, so you sort of get an understanding, because it's a little bit different than the typical kind of optimization problems you might have in material science or sometimes in chemistry, where AI for science is applied very successfully. Then I'll briefly showcase you the system AutoRA, and then I'll talk about some of the sub-problems we have to solve and some of the next steps. So if you think about the scientific process in cognitive science, it's this iteration between experimentation, through web-based data collection, model inference, meaning that we build scientific models of the data, and then we try to design new experiments. And this can be broken down into several steps. For instance, designing an experiment often involves figuring out sort of values for existing variables. Like, let's say you want to show some kind of experiment where you study how people can perceive the luminosity of a stimulus. So you can manipulate things like the duration of the stimulus, the luminosity itself, and so on. You basically have a structured experiment, but you need to find values, right? How to parameterize the experiment. And this is, of course, something that has been addressed already in other domains like machine learning in the sense of active learning. How can we find good data points to label, right? Good experiments to label in this case, or the form of optimal experimental design, which has been successfully applied in cognitive psychology. We oftentimes also have this problem that we need to very carefully counterbalance the factors of interest, let's say the luminosity of a stimulus, with factors that we don't care about so much, but are nevertheless playing a role. Let's say where the stimulus is presented, or the time during the day during which the experiment is performed. And this is a problem called that's related to sampling experimental conditions, and more specifically, proper counterbalancing. And we have some tools here that I won't talk about today, but there are some tools already that we can use from computer science to solve this too. Now, the real discovery is in experimental design. I would argue that most of you agree with this, and you may be encountering very similar problems with your AI scientists, is not to use a fixed experiment and reparameterize it. The real discoveries come from redesigning an entire experiment, identifying new variables of interest to manipulate, new dependent variables to measure, and maybe changing the entire experiment structure, right? This is a very hard problem. And it is the aspect of experimental design that I would argue in our field at least has yielded significant discoveries. So that being said, we see some approaches, for instance, in physics, where people leverage experiment grammars or declarative program languages to sort of automate this aspect as well. So there are some approaches emerging, at least in the field, that we could potentially leverage for this. Now, ever since the pandemic, cognitive scientists very much rely on online behavioral data collection. We use various services like Prolific, Amazon Mechanical Turk to host experiments, recruit participants, pay them automatically, and so on. So this problem has already been solved since the pandemic. The much more interesting problem for us is the problem of finding good scientific models automatically. And every cognitive scientist could probably tell you, given a certain model, how can I find good parameters for that model so to fit the data? That's just fitting, right? And we have various methods like Bayesian inference, gradient descent, you name it, to address this problem. The more interesting problem in our case is to find a good set of models. What we typically do is we say, hey, I have these 5 hypotheses. I want to operationalize them in 5 different models, and I'm going to compare which model fits best and therefore supports one of those 5 hypotheses best. And that involves building basically different models, writing different programs, coming up with different equations to simulate mind and behavior. Now that's a harder problem, and I'm going to talk about that problem, and we're going to leverage some techniques from equation discovery and neural model-based discovery for that. And then finally, of course, we use many different kinds of models, like Bayesian models, reinforcement learning models, sequential sampling models, statistical models. There's many different classes of models, and this is a much broader problem to solve. Given the scientific problem, which kind of model do we want to use? But here, again, I will briefly talk about this. We can leverage things like program synthesis that helps us basically, formulate the model search as a program search problem, and that way address it too. Now, the point of this slide is to show you that every of those aspects of the scientific process, at least in behavioral research, web-based behavioral research, is somewhat solved as a subproblem. And it's like, different puzzle pieces lying around, potentially scattered even across disciplines. And what we've been trying to do is kind of put these puzzle pieces together, right, in the form of a declarative language that we call AutoRA that enables an integration of these things. And here in this talk, if there is enough time, I will focus on mostly the problem related to model inference and potentially experimental design, how we can automate this. Now, before I do that, I would like to introduce you to AutoRA, this language that we use for automating empirical research. It's basically, you can think of it as a declarative language where you can express how you would like to go about the research process, which kind of methods to use to find models, what methods to use to sample experiments, and how to run them. And the language will kind of take care of the rest, sort of solve the problem itself. Because there's no right way of doing research, we figured, you might as well build a language in which people can express different kind of research workflows. Now, to introduce you to the system, very briefly, and I will do this indeed briefly because you're already familiar with it, you can think of it as sort of two different agents interacting with one another. One of them is a autonomous theorist that then tries to identify models that best fit the data, and the other one is an autonomous experimentalist that may identify models that cannot be predicted by the theorist. And so in some ways, they're kind of interacting with one another, and one form of this interaction could be an adversarial one, where the experimentalists always try to find models that invalidate, experiments that invalidate the theorist's models, whereas the theorist just tries to improve those models based on new data. And of course, these agents, they will have to interact with a participant environment, right, with some kind of web-based data collection tool. And now, since this is all very abstract, I would like to invite you to try out a demo just to kind of get this idea back. I might have asked you to do it already, and maybe you can transfer some learning skills here. But this is it's a good way of understanding sort of the subproblems of this thing. For that, I'll may ask you to use your phone. So if you have your phone with you, you may pick out your phone. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a simulation. Let me just do that real quick. I have way too many PyCharm windows open. Here we go, and start it. All right. So you can hopefully see my screen right here. And what you see here is this sort of AutoRA kind of I don't know, visual display. And what's happening now is that the experimentalist is trying to come up with a set of experiments. Or maybe I should say a word about the kind of experiment I'm going to ask you to do. It involves basically choosing between blue and red boxes, and you have to figure out which of those boxes gives you more reward. The location of the boxes will change, so you can ignore that. That's an irrelevant factor. You only have to pay attention to the color of the boxes and basically select the box that gives you more points. But the reward probabilities of those boxes will change over time, so you kind of have to exploit. And it's basically, for those of you familiar with this is a two-arm bandit experiment. So because this is a live demo, there is always the risk of it not working. Fortunately, so far, everything's going well. What's happening currently in the background is that the experimentalist is trying to come up with a good sequence of rewards for those boxes, and it then comes up with a particular experiment that it then will upload to the web server. And once it's hosted there, it will then basically just come up with a QR code and then present this QR code here on the bottom right of the screen that you can then scan, and then you can perform the experiment. I set it up for about 10 participants, so we should have enough space to perform it. Okay, let's see what's happening. It did create the experiment. So hopefully in a second, we will see the QR code up and running. I should note that, yeah, perfect. So we can now scan this QR code. And your goal is now to basically, try to figure out which box gives you more points. And the reward probability of the, boxes will change. Again, ignore the position. It doesn't matter. It's only the color that matters. And there's a score on the bottom that if you want, you can keep track of too. This looks like quite a sparse reward environment here.
Yeah, I feel very unfulfilled.
Yeah, me too. So this is apparently a bad experiment to start off with. But we have to live with every single time I run this. We get a different. I didn't set a seed or anything, so it's a different experiment every single time. And we have about 50 seconds left, and we already collected data from 4 participants, so that's great.
Yeah.
And 7.
It's like,
I think it's mostly zeros is the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what you can see on the bottom left here is a plot of the experiment where you can see on the x-axis the trials. So those are the trials of the experiment, and whenever you see a red dot, it means that the red box, the red box was rewarded. Whenever you see a blue dot, it means that the blue one got rewarded. So you can see it's generally quite sparse towards the end. So we'll wait now for the last 10 seconds to pass, and once it happens, the data from an online server, the behavioral data, will be sent back to the computer. It's all anonymized, of course, and will be deleted after this. And what's happening now is we can see already the average choice probability on the y-axis. So the screen thing here is basically a probability of whether we're leaning towards the blue or the red box. And so in the beginning, I guess, we're sort of drifting a little towards blue, and then sort of like in the middle. Again, it seems like quite a bad experiment in the first place to reveal something about learning. But what happened now is that the theorists actually began to discover a reinforcement learning model capable of capturing the data. And as you might observe, this model looks a little bit different than a traditional kind of reinforcement learning model you might be familiar with. And that's because it uses a tool that I will talk about, a discovery method, that is capable of searching over a space of about 130 billion models. So that's quite a large space to search over, and it is indeed capable of finding models that outperform those of human scientists, both in terms of fit and complexity. So here you can of course get the large language model generated interpretation of the model, but I will talk more about how this method works, because it's not that trivial. But you get the idea, right? And while I was talking, I obviously paused the program. It could just continue, come up with a new experiment. The next one would be designed to differentiate between the 2 best models, the 2 best competing models in this space. And that would be a more informative experiment. So now let me go back to the presentation and maybe tell you more about how this actually works. And before that, I just want to highlight that this infrastructure, and we're talking about collecting real-world data here, right, from real participants. And I used to actually run this thing in the background while I was giving the talk, and would collect data from participants around the world. That's very expensive, so I can't do that anymore. But in principle, you get the idea. You could run an entire study while giving a talk, and that is very attractive. But it requires mostly a lot of infrastructure, just in terms of automating and coordinating the data collection, and very, very little of it is AI, really, is AI-driven discovery. But I will talk about those aspects now, beginning with the model inference. So before that, I just want to highlight there are many different kinds of models in our domain, and we have very qualitative models like verbal models, and we have statistical models. And here I will focus on the discovery of analytical computation models. Analytical models just being plain equations. right? And computational models being something more complex, something that we have to simulate on a computer. And now I want to address the really hard, or I think, hard question of why should we do it in the first place? Like, why even involve AI in the scientific model discovery process? Well, one of the motivations is that traditional models do not do so well. This is a study performed by Maria Eckstein, a colleague at Google DeepMind, who basically fitted a traditional reinforcement learning model to human data as a function of the data set size that you can find here on the x-axis. And she basically recorded the model fit, so the lower the better. And what she observed was that for traditional models, here shown in red, you kind of saturate off really early on, and then you don't really gain much from more data points. Whereas if you kind of fit like a black box LSTM, you sort of get quite far, and there's a huge gap, right, between the best human model that she could find, and the black box. And this means that there is additional variance to be explained, right? So we can basically now, there's a reason to leverage kind of other systems that may be capable of explaining this gap. Another issue lies in our scientific practice. Again, I've told you that when we do modeling, it is for the purpose of hypothesis testing, which means that we figure out how can we formulate our hypotheses in terms of a computation model, then we fit those models, and then we can evaluate those hypotheses quantitatively. And for this process, we often consider maybe 5-6 models. I think the largest set of models that someone has compared that I've seen was about 70. And that's quite a lot. But as you can imagine, it's a lot of effort because you have to go into the literature and think about which model could it be, and this one, and this one, this one. And of course, there's a much larger space of human discovered models that we could have considered, right? And an even larger space of possible models that humans didn't even consider yet. And so there is there is this obviously incentive to kind of address that with AI-driven discovery. And finally, the most important, and I think that the hardest problem, and the one that really riddles our discipline, is the following. It's that of model fragmentation. And this is very common to these kind of empirical disciplines where studying complex systems. Consider, for instance, the following scenario, right? You have an experiment with certain factors here, and you fit a model to the experiment to explain the data, and you find that model 1 fits best. Now and when I talk about model, I talk about something like a reinforcement learning model, for instance, right? That has different components, and there are different equations to operationalize them. For instance, to study human learning behavior. Now, people, what they love to do is to say, hey, I have my model, I discovered which one fits best. Now I'm going to predict behavior in a new experiment. And they go to the new experiment and they find out, oh, that model actually performs very poorly. It's another model that fits best. And they do a third experiment and they find the same thing. It's another model that fits best. Very frustrating because we don't really have an understanding of what's going on here, right? Because it's different models, different experiments. Okay, so well. Of course, we are also interested in explaining individual differences. And oftentimes what people do is they try to fit one model to the experiment and then express the differences between individuals as differences in parameters. Okay? And we can do this across experiments. Another strategy, and more, I think that really does greater justice to the individual differences here, is one where you fit basically a model to different individuals, and you figure out for which individual does a different model fit best, because different individuals use different strategies. But then you end up with something like this, and this is basically a cartoon depiction of our literature, right? And now imagine trying to make sense of this. It's very, very difficult. And in fact, virtually impossible for the kind of approaches that we've been using so far. What we would like to have instead, this is what we are striving for, is this kind of conceptualization or categorization of, okay, these components of a model, they are universal. They apply to all of the experiments. And these cognitive components, they arise because of specific experimental conditions. And there are these other components of models, they pop up as individual differences. And if that's the kind of understanding we want to generate in cognitive science, but we are very far from doing that.
Wait, can I ask a question about this one?
Absolutely, yeah.
So this looks to me like the general problem of taxonomizing an academic field into something that will suddenly work forever, but that's impossible, right? Why would AI help with this?
I will hopefully convince you in a few slides how it could help with this. It has to do with the problem of how to basically represent cognitive processes across experiments and individuals, and how to essentially model them. And previously we have been, again, working in a space where we consider separate experiments, separate models, and we play this game of fitting and so on. And I'm arguing for a different approach that's needed. And, maybe we can come back to this once I showed you that. I hope will sort of solve this problem.
I guess I'm curious why it's not a sociology problem, because even if everyone else uses AI, they might choose to send it in the different directions. I guess this will only be solved if everyone uses the same AI system, right?
That's correct, exactly. But just to, I mean, you pose this as a sort of like a large taxonomy problem. I would, say that, I mean, that would be an amazing goal to have, right? A taxonomy across all cognitive science. We have this within very small disciplines, like let's say human reinforcement learning. It's a vast field. It's a very, very small part of cognitive science, but we would already benefit from such an understanding in this domain. That would already be a major advancement to our knowledge, scientific knowledge. And there, I, would hope that we would, no matter which AI system we use, we would have come to some kind of understanding. And of course, I mean, we should use different AI systems because we want to, see if those things are stable and method independent, right? But the common language in our domain to express those cognitive mechanisms is math. So whichever system you're using, if you wanted to, make it interpretable, you want to boil it down to basically equations and terms. And those are the things that we can, relate to and interpret.
Thanks.
All right, this is an excellent question. So let's go through how this might be approached, and I'll walk you through sort of 3 different approaches, and I've mentioned them only very briefly, and then get to the one that we've been using. One of them is equation discovery. That's a very simple method that essentially attempts to represent equations as trees, and you might already be familiar with this, right? Where you have the dependent variables represented as the root of the tree, and the independent variables here, x1 and x2, as the leaves, and you may have some parameters. And then the model search problem becomes a tree search problem. And while this method has been applied in simple domains of cognition like psychophysics, we must acknowledge that most equation discovery methods developed, they require that the variables of the equation to be discovered are all observable. And that is a fundamental limitation when it comes to cognitive science, because most of our models are of computational nature, in which we're trying to express cognition as a latent dynamical system, meaning that we're often interested in explaining the evolution of variables that we cannot observe. Take, for instance, reinforcement learning, right, where we have values for certain options that we try to model in people's brains as a function of some learning rate and reward and so on. We oftentimes, unless the experiment is explicit about it, do not measure those values explicitly, right? We often try to infer them from choices, for instance. Very similar problem in decision-making, where we use the so-called accumulator models, sequential sampling models, that accumulate some kind of evidence towards one of 2 response options. The benefit of those models being that you can model things like reaction times. But the premise is that you have some kind of evidence variable that integrates over time. And the problem here is to infer those kind of cognitive latent mechanisms from a very low-dimensional observational space. And this is a fundamentally ill-posed problem, because there could be, in principle, for a given data set, an infinite number of dynamical systems explaining those behavior, unless it's a very clever experiment. And so it is, that itself is a problem, right? But the other problem is, how do we even make this inference? And there's been some approaches in cognitive science, they use basically neural networks to solve this. And the way you can think about it is that you have, let's say, a data set of humans playing a reinforcement learning experiment, like you did in the demo. And what we're trying to do is kind of infer some kind of, learning algorithm that underlies human behavior. And the process of doing that would be fitting a neural network to replicate the human behavior. Not to do the task, but to replicate the human behavior, predict what the human will do. And once we've done that, we can use it as a model of the human's cognition, and then put a lot of effort into basically analyzing what's going on in this black box. And there's been some colleagues and some recent work also appeared in Nature that try to do that. And it's quite laborious to actually analyze those networks and figure that stuff out. This is what all of the work goes into. Another problem is that it is, it's very data hungry. It usually requires lots of data points. It's not readily interpretable, of course, because we have to do lots of work. And it doesn't solve this empirical fragmentation problem, right? Understanding differences in cognitive mechanisms across experiments and individuals. Now, the other approach is a program synthesis that's appearing, and this is a similar approach where we basically just provide some program synthesis algorithm. In this case, it's a large language based model-based one, to write basically a cognitive program that fits the data, and we provide feedback about the model's performance in terms of complexity and fit and so on. The issue here is, again, it's very computationally expensive, and it often yields a lot of different kinds of programs that are extremely diverse, and you have this scattering, this fragmentation all over. Now, in terms of programs, and you don't know how to synthesize them in any integrative knowledge. So what we've been trying to do is kind of combine this neural network model discovery and equation discovery to basically try to address all of those three problems. And I'm only going to talk very abstractly about what's going on. I'm happy to come back to it, and if you want to know about the details. But the basic idea is that we have a behavioral data set. We then use a recurrent neural network that we fit to the behavioral data set. And we then basically construct the neural network in a way that it only has a very low dimensional space that it can use to explain the behavior, the latent space. In fact, each of the latent variables is a scalar that essentially we can model as a time series once we fit the neural network to the human participants. And then we can symbolically regress the time series. And we're using something like Cindy for that, which then yields interpretable cognitive equations. And the way this looks like is essentially, it's a huge, recurrent neural net with some inputs and some modules, some cognitive modules that basically represent essentially a cognitive theory. And this is serving two purposes. First of all, we can, each of these boxes, you can think of a scalar value, right? That is being updated as a function of different inputs and outputs. And the good thing is that we can design those boxes in such a way that they complement, a theoretical framework, let's say, of human reinforcement learning. So we can readily interpret the equations associated with each of those boxes in the context of the theory. That's one thing. The other thing that it achieves is that we can go beyond mere explanation or prediction once we have identified those equation terms, because we can actually are capable, as I will show you, to identify basically reliably differences in those cognitive mechanisms. So we can actually make sure that what we discovered is reliable, is stable. And it's not that we can come up with 1,000 different solutions. No, it's actually very well constrained. And then a crucial ingredient in this RNN is basically an embedding that contextualizes properties of the participants, but also the experiments. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to hierarchically model the data. So you can think of the recurrent neural network basically as trying to figure out a group model that explains average behavior across tasks and participants. And these embeddings, what they do is they basically contextualize the dynamics learned and figure out which experiment or participant properties change the dynamics in which manner. And you can see where I'm getting at. This is the kind of information that we need to get an integrative understanding. But it's also helping from a statistical perspective because we can pool data across participants and experiments, making this more data efficient. Now I'm going to skip a bunch of slides here in the interest of time, and we'll show you that this method is indeed capable of accurately recovering latent dynamics of very different modules that are not directly observable, just based on choices in a reinforcement learning experiment. And more so, when applied to real-world data, we can use the system, and this is in fact the system that I used in the demo. We can use this to compare it to human-made models, and we can show that it indeed outperforms those models that we can see here of human experiments and human-made models. So they're not just obviously considering fit, but they're also considering model complexity. And what is now possible with this is to express individual differences, not only in differences in parameters, but in addition, in differences in equation terms. For instance, this participant on the left has a learning rate, alpha, in a reinforcement learning experiment that's a constant. Whereas the one on the right has a learning rate that's actually a dynamical system itself. It changes as a function of itself. And that is something, that's a meaningful individual difference in terms of structure. And to this might seem trivial, but from a cognitive scientist perspective, it is absolutely not, because you can, our entire domain, including clinical aspects of psychology, clinical psychiatry, computational psychiatry, it lives on a premise that we can express individual differences solely as differences in parameters of the very same model that applies to all of us. That is obviously a too simplifying assumption, right? We all apply different algorithms to tasks. So it makes sense to express those differences also in differences in structure of the cognitive mechanisms. And so we can now use this method to basically count what kind of cognitive mechanisms are present or absent in certain participants, in certain groups. So here we have done a study where we applied this to like a computational psychiatry data set, and we could identify meaningful structural differences between healthy or not depressed and depressed patients, and so on. So this is essentially hoping, and we're now applying this also to basically incorporate many different experiments to then be able to understand what are structural differences across experiments and how can we disentangle them from individual differences and gain a unified understanding of what I was telling you before. Now, I don't have much time left, so I want to maybe relate to some major problems in the field rather than going into another subproblem of experimental design. I think one of them being basically the problem of data collection. So data collection is still a very, very expensive and time-consuming aspect in cognitive science, and wouldn't it be fantastic if we could automate that away? Meaning that we could use some kind of in silico, simulators of human behavior to collect some data and maybe preliminary data that we can then investigate and validate in vivo. The idea being that we can do fast in silico prototyping with some kind of, simulator of a participant, and then in vivo, alignment. Now, there have been approaches to that, and I want to caution against those. You might have seen that science.I paper, the large language model as a foundation model of cognition, at least what it claims to be. But which could arguably be used to simulate human behavior. But we've been doing very careful experiments with this in the hope that we could leverage it as a synthetic participant. And we made a really interesting observation, which is that it is very not only far away from a model of cognition, it's also very far away of a simulator and predictor of human behavior. And the problem is the following. Basically, just to summarize what we found was that when you align a large language model to predict human behavior in an experiment, what happens is that because human behavior is very autoregressive, meaning that it is sufficient to actually look at your past choices to predict your future choices. I don't even need to see the experiment information. Basically, what we found is that this alignment leads to the fact that the large language model ends up completely ignoring experimental information. In fact, if you remove the experiment prompt entirely from the model, it is as capable of explaining the human data, and it's even outperforming all the human cognitive models as before. And this leads to the problem that when you ask the model to actually respond to an experiment by generating data from scratch, it can't do that. Yeah, it really fails to do so because it learned to ignore the experiment information, being worse of a cognitive model than before. So that's something I want to caution against. And the other thing I want to sort of note is that we have this problem of multi-level modeling, right? Where we basically, we talked about taxonomies, right? We noticed from other disciplines where we have different kind of levels of explanation, let's say ontological, structural, and process models that all inform each other. And we do have the same thing in cognition, right? Where we have different versions, let's say, of models of working memory. Some being more verbal, on the verbal level, some being more on the sort of box and arrow level, and some being very computational that we eventually need to really make contact with data, and they all inform each other. But we haven't really solved the problem of automating discovery across levels of explanation yet. That is, I would argue, something that remains to be solved in general in the domain of AI for science. And here we're making a first attempt of doing so by leveraging the different levels of descriptions that we here really need to operationalize our, let's say, theories or models of human learning, for instance, using this architecture I was showing before. But then what remains is, of course, this problem of integrating this information that is very diverse, right? In this loop, we have so many different things that we operate on: experiments, experiment factors, and so on, models, model terms, and so on. And the approach that we are now taking is basically based on the premise that scientific content is relational. If we have an experiment, we have experiment factors describing it, we have participants participating in it, and so on. We have analyses and hypotheses, and so on. All of these things are related. So now what we're doing is basically trying to leverage this as a way of integrating discovery, across broader spaces of experiments and populations. And the particular subproblems that we're trying to address here are, the fact that different subtasks of the scientific process, right, require different approaches. We have this diverse content that we need to represent, and we want, of course, this content to be explainable and robust. Something that you might know is not as easy to do with those discovery systems. And so we are leveraging multi-agent systems, of course, but we're really focusing on knowledge graphs as a way of representing the scientific knowledge, and then using RAG to inform the multi-agent systems, and importantly, protect the content being added into the knowledge graph through verifiable tools. And we're trying out different kinds of architectures here, multi-agent systems. And just to give you a sort of like basic idea of what we're doing is we for instance, have this knowledge graph right here that represents, let's say, cognitive mechanisms discovered in orange. It also represents things like participant features like age and gender and experimental variables and experiments and so on. And the way this operates is that, of course, you have a vast knowledge graph, right? And you don't even know where to start. So we leverage things like link prediction to figure out what things in the graph can I actually predict in terms of, let's say, cognitive mechanisms. And then we can, run this prediction mechanism and feed the information, the result of the statistical analysis, back into the graph as a first level citizen. And once we're done with that, maybe a different agent comes and figures out, okay, what are the relevant features that could be predicting this without even running a statistical analysis. I just want to get a sense of what features I should consider for statistical analysis. So we're running this kind of feature importance analysis, feeding the information back. And then once we have those, we can start searching for statistical models in a much more informed, data-constrained manner. And here we may run and compare different statistical models. And once we have those added back again as basically as information that's really grounded in data. We can then use that to derive new hypotheses and represent them and really link all of it together. This has the very benefit that we can trace the entire process, the entire thought process, and it's at each point really grounded in data in a knowledge graph that we can validate. And it's enormously robust. So if we actually apply this to simulated data where we hide very specific hypotheses, like that forgetting of unchosen actions is age dependent, that is something that the system can reliably extract. Even though there's lots of noise and lots of alternative hypotheses and models to explore, because it is very, very, very much constrained in the way it uses the tools, we can ensure quite impressive robustness. And of course, you can go on and start doing really interesting stuff like asking where our knowledge gaps and so on.
Sebastian, this knowledge graph seems like a model of the scientific process rather than the domain itself. That is, I could take this graph and apply it to a totally new domain like Alzheimer's or computer science. So am I understanding right? This isn't a model of the human cognition, it's a model of the scientific process itself.
Exactly. Both the process and the information collected during the process. And in fact, this is a perfect segue. This is my last set of slides where I just want to note that we've been attempting to, obviously being heavily inspired by work from you guys. We're now trying to use this kind of setup to also tackle discovery world, where I think it is a much harder problem where we can't really go in with a particular schema for the knowledge graph that we know ahead of time, let's say, works for discovering reinforcement learning models. We actually have to discover the schema from scratch, right? We have to come up with a good schema to represent measurement instruments and other things that we might want to be using in this world. So our goal is next to actually, apply this here and see, how far we get. And we also had this funny idea. You might see it at some point. I'll send you a link once it works. We're also wondering if we could, provide some kind of outreach in a sense to the public of, what AI for science, how it works, how, what it can do, in the sense of maybe, posting screenshots of Discovery World and asking through polls on Instagram, the public, what should I do next to model really human interaction? I think this is something that we as scientists should also do, is of course, engage the public and keep them in the loop about all the crazy stuff that's going on, even though it's changing very quickly. And yeah, my last words are maybe that I think we should very carefully also think about how we should design science for AI. So, and I think as an inspiration, I think we can take this very example from robotics, right? Pipetting, where we know, of course, the solution to very effective pipetting and automation of pipetting is not to build robots that as accurately as possible simulate our human hands. No, it is to redesign the pipette. And I think it's the very same thing for AI for science. And I think it is worthwhile, of course, exploring better and better AI systems, but it is also worthwhile asking, what about the scientific process itself? And I mean infrastructure, right? Incentives, everything should be changed to be amenable for AI systems. And because I think the way we've been doing it, right? We all need jobs. We all have egos. All of those things structure our academic landscape in a way that it may not be much in service of scientific discovery, right? Talking about frequent publications and replicability crises and all of that stuff, and maybe even the representation of knowledge in the form of papers, right? All of these things, I think, as we keep doing this stuff, we should really rethink how we are. Maybe we should be redesigning the scientific process itself in aid of really accelerating scientific discovery. Now, with that, of course, I want to highlight the people who've been actually working on this, and there's been sort of two groups involved. One of them is this autonomous empirical research group that's in the institutional and in our lab here in Osnabrück. And of course, thank you very much for enduring this quick-paced talk about cognitive science, and I'm happy to take any questions if there are any for the remainder of the time.
Thanks. Questions?
I have one question. This idea of using neural nets to fit these models so I think it was box number 3 of what you can do.
Yeah.
I didn't quite understand what the RNN thing, what's actually going on there. So it seems like you're using the RNN to parameterize a variable in an equation model, or?
That's correct. So you can think of the RNN as having different submodules within it, so very small networks within the RNN that have a single scalar value. And by fitting the RNN, we basically parameterize these submodules. Now, these submodules being a single scalar value, it is very convenient to read them out because we can basically just, once the RNN is fitted, we can just simulate it on experiment data. And we basically get, after this fit, we basically get a time series for every of those values. And for this time series, we can then apply equation discovery, meaning that we can find a symbolic, potentially nonlinear expression of this time series, a dynamical system that essentially operationalizes the dynamics learned by the neural network for each of those scalar variables.
Mm-hmm. So there's a separate component which is doing the discovery, like the Q is equal to.
Exactly, and that is basically, you can think of it as a large but sparse regression with many terms, some of which are nonlinear. And what we're then basically trying to do is explain this time series as a function of this library components that we consider potentially relevant for the discovery process. And then we essentially, it's sparse, right? So it tries to basically zero out as many of those library components as possible. And from that, we essentially get an equation like this, that looks like this. And it can be any form, but because it's sparse, it actually helps us, keeping tractable models that are also simple in nature.
But in this process, what comes first, the neural network or the equation?
The neural network.
Okay.
And we currently have.
Go the other way as well.
Yeah, well, we currently, so one of the challenges is, of course, that this is a sequential step, and the representations learned by the neural network may not be well suited to explain them in terms of equations. So what we just implemented and what works quite well is a joint fitting approach. So basically what you're doing is you're doing both in parallel, and you're using the loss from the equation to also influence the weights from in the neural network. So we can actually do joint estimation, and that helps getting better, basically dynamics learned by those recurrent neural networks that are more expressible in terms of the equations that we can discover.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Peter.
Hi, Sebastian. Super cool stuff. Just keeping an eye on the clock, I'll try and ask my question very quickly. A lot of your talk was focused more on the equation modeling aspects, but at the start you said something super tantalizing, which is that you were thinking about using AI to design new experimental paradigms. A lot of the giant leaps in cognitive science have come when somebody's designed some new way of measuring something or new experimental paradigm. My favorite one is Gene Mandler, the famous developmental psychologist. Before the 80s, people used to think that babies had nothing going on and didn't have a conceptual world going on. And then she discovered that you could put these two paradigms together and measure them. Have you done any work on that? Or are you just teasing us that you're going to do work on that?
Unfortunately, I had too little time to talk about it. But I'm really grateful for your question, that I can slip in some of this stuff. So the aspect that you mentioned is beautiful, because that's exactly the kind of thing we had in mind, which cannot be solved by starting with a large design space and then searching within it. No, it has to be a different approach where you think about experiments in a different way. And here we take experiment or inspiration from physics and computer science, where experiments are basically expressed in the form of graphs or programs. And we've developed a declarative language to express those experiments as form of computation graphs, where you can basically come up with new kinds of expressions for stimuli. Let me actually show this here. This is a better example, where you might say, okay, I have these core Lego pieces, these core components of experiments that are so general that they allow for enough generalization across different domains. And I can come up with, of course, different instances of different factors, but also different features, like how long should I show a stimulus? But one of the core discoveries made in cognitive psychology is also a combination of basic features. So for instance, in the very classic Stroop task, where you're shown a color word and you have to respond to the color and not the word itself, like the word red shown in green. What matters here, the variable that revolutionized the field of cognitive control, is this dependent variable called congruency. It just measures if the word and the color match. And this is something that can be derived, right, as a simple primitive function from very basic variables. And so we're trying to leverage the kind of graph or program expression of experiments as a way of solving the kinds of problems that you're coming up with. So, but just to set this into context, we're at the state of representing the experiments, right? That this is the solution we found so far, not the search part, right? We're not there yet. But to start there, we have to actually first figure out how do we represent the Lego pieces, basically, of our domain.
Super exciting. We should book you for 3 hours next time.
I agree with that.
Right, we're at time, I'm afraid, so we'll have to stop at this point. Sebastian, super interesting, really exciting work you and your lab are doing. Thank you again for staying up so late in Germany to present to us, and look forward to continuing to interact with you. Let's give Sebastian another round of applause.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
All right, thanks a lot, Sebastian.
Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.